Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a series review for the Trent series by Karin. This is an adult procedural cop thriller series. There are 9 books in it so far, and I read all 9 of those books in the past month and a half. So, instead of doing individual reviews on each of those 9 books, because that would be way too excessive and unnecessary, I'm going to review all of them in this video by doing a full review for the first book in the series and then giving you my ratings and standouts for the other 8 books and then just kind of like summarizing general thoughts about the series on a whole. I kind of went on a bit of a Karin binge in October and November, so there's a lot to talk about here and I'm just going to get right into it. The first book in the series, the one I will be reviewing in full, is Triptych. This is the first in the Trent series. This is your introduction to Trent. Now, before I get into the book, I do want to explain and define the title because I do think it's actually important to the book and it's something that doesn't make sense unless you look up what triptych actually means. Triptych is kind of a series or a collection of 3 that connect and interweave in a way. And I think it's a really good title for this book, and it's a really good explanation of what this book is. There are 3 sections in this book, and each of them focus on a different character. First, we have Detective Michael Ormwood, who is a cop. And then we have a recently paroled rapist and murderer who's gotten out of prison recently and is trying to adjust to the world. And then the third and final section is Trent himself. Each of these story threads take place at a different time, focus on a different character, have a different point of view, and there is overlap. They all do tie together, but they're also kind of separate. I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 stars, and for me, that's out of the norm when it comes to cop thrillers. I really like reading them, but in general, I don't find too many that are above a 3-star rating for me. They just tend to be 3-star average, fun for now, but I forget them very quickly. And while this one has faded a lot, and in general, these books have faded, just because in my experience, thrillers fade very quickly for me. They're very fun in the moment, and then they fade. They've stuck with me a lot more than perhaps other thrillers by other authors have. I'm going to start with the negatives because most of this review is just going to be me being like, these books are great, you should definitely read them if you like cop thrillers. So, negatives, I'm not entirely convinced I like the characters. Some of the characters are intentionally unlikable, and that's fine. I think she does a really great job of crafting these unlikable characters. But the problem is that the main characters are also unlikable. I'm just not the biggest fan of Trent, and I don't really dislike him either. It's just that I'm kind of neutral on him as a whole. And I feel that way throughout all of these books, but this was kind of the introduction. We don't really know him that well. I don't care about him. I'm not invested in him. He's kind of an interesting vehicle in which to tell the story, but in general, I just don't really care. He kind of exists. And that's honestly a little bit fine for cop thrillers. If this were any other kind of book, not liking the main character a lot is not a good thing for me. But in cop thrillers, it's kind of just if you're neutral on the main detective character, that's fine. They don't really influence the book too much just because it is so heavily about the story and the cases that they're working. I also think the general storytelling style in this was kind of difficult for me because it is told in those 3 sections, like I explained at the beginning. And it's really interesting, it's well done, but it did make it kind of hard to get into, not knowing anything about any of these people. You don't know Trent. This is your first introduction to him. So it's a bit strange that he was kind of only introduced in the final third. Or he was introduced earlier, but he didn't have a point of view until the final third, and I was kind of confused, and I was like, was this mislabeled as the first in the Trent series? But it's not. It really is. You get to know him later, but he is more of a focal point in the rest of the books in the series. This is the only book that really focuses on the victims and other cops that aren't main characters in the series. So it was weird. It was hard to get into, and it felt kind of jarring to just go from Michael Ormwood, the detective section, to this ex-felon who raped and murdered a girl when he was a teenager. And it's different timeline as well because we're skipping back in time to hear a lot about the girl that he killed and all of that, and it's very it's kind of jumpy and it's kind of jarring because it's just like because it's just these three entirely different stories that work together. But while you're reading it, it's not really working. It's like once you're putting the pieces together, it's like, oh my God, this all fits together so, so well. But at the time of reading it, it was like a little bit jarring and a little bit strange to get through. And my last negative point is that I did figure out who the killer was about halfway through. And not because, like, I'm so amazing, like, I know everything. It's like the book basically tells you. Like, not explicitly, but it's you're kind of meant to figure out who the killer is halfway through this book, which is fine because it's not really about that. But because you did figure out who the killer was, the last like third of this book was very much just waiting for the killer to get caught. And like you know who it is, you know what's going to happen, and it just turns into kind of a waiting game of like you're waiting for this to happen, you're waiting for them to finally put the pieces together because you already have all the pieces. It's just the detectives that don't. You're like, Will Trent, come on, Will Trent, like you can do this, like just arrest the guy already. And it was just a little bit frustrating in the end. Like, I do feel like the final third could have been shortened just a little bit, like made it a little bit more concise so I wasn't waiting quite so long for that big dramatic ending, just because after a while I really did know like what was going to happen, how it was going to happen, and waiting for it did get a little bit tedious and a little bit just like, okay, please end already. But that being said, I loved this book so, so much. This was such a great introduction to the series. I think this is probably in my top two books in the series overall if I was to rank them, which I'm not going to do because there are too many and they're all basically the same book. But this one was wonderful. Like, sometimes when I'm reading cop series, I'm like, oh, well, the books get better later on. And it's not that the books don't get better later on, they do kind of like change a little. But this one was so good that if you're going to read this series, I do really recommend starting with this one just because it was wonderful. I really, really love her writing style. It's so dark and so gritty and just so entirely engrossing. Like, I read this book in a day. I read honestly most of the 9 books in this series in just a day each because I would just sit down and like not want to stop. Even the ones that I liked a little bit less were still, I'd pick it up and read it in a day. She does such a good job of making the reader uncomfortable. And I don't mean that as a negative thing, although for some people that definitely would be a negative if you don't like for books to make you feel uncomfortable. This makes you feel very uncomfortable. That's her goal, in the same way that like a sad book is trying to make you feel sad. This is trying to make you uncomfortable with these people, with their actions, with the way she's describing corpses. Like, it's just a very uncomfortable book, and it had me like on the edge of my seat because I was like, ooh, like, did you really have to say that about this dead woman's body? Like, that's so cringy, but like in that way that felt really good. And I love that. And it's definitely a dark, gritty thriller. It's not for the faint of heart because I was definitely reading this like, ooh, I read a lot of thrillers. And this is a little bit rough, even for me, but in a way that like I really enjoyed that because I do think I've been like desensitized kind of because I have read a fair number of cop thrillers, so it's nice to have something that does kind of come out and just like shock you and be like, oh, that's quite a description of this corpse. Like, wow, that's quite the slur you used there. Was that really necessary? But it works in her stories because of who her characters are and of what kind of people they are. And it's like they might be saying something terrible, but it's fine because the character is terrible and you're supposed to think it's terrible. Or because the character just kind of sucks and you're supposed to think that they suck. And it works really, really well together. And I loved that. But yes, please do take that as a warning if you don't like really gritty thrillers, if you don't like things that are going to be like graphic or dark, especially in terms of like sexual violence was a big one, in terms of like graphic descriptions of bodies or like slurs that are used. She's very graphic and she wants to make you uncomfortable and she really succeeds at making you uncomfortable, but she does it in a very good way that I really enjoyed. It didn't feel like she was trying to be shocking for the sake of shocking. It felt like she was trying to make you feel uncomfortable in very specific ways, and it made the book feel very like visceral for me. I also want to add that there was a plot twist in this book that got me so hard. Like, I did mention earlier that I guessed who the killer was, but I really do think you were supposed to. Like, I didn't get it soon before she, like, almost. She didn't explicitly say it until the end, but it was kind of like, oh, this is the killer. That makes sense. Like, everyone in this book knows who the killer is at this point. Except for Will Trent. Like, go figure. But there was another plot twist in this book that got me so hard. And I'm not someone who gets got by plot twists usually. Like, I either can explicitly see them coming and I've already, like, predicted them, or I didn't see them coming, but when they happen, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. That works for the story. Like, I can see how that happened. The plot twist happened. I was like, oh my God. And I like put it down for 10 minutes and it was just like going back through and rereading certain sections. And I was like, how did this happen? How did I not see this coming at all? And it made me so mad, but in such like a good way. Like that way where like it got me really hard and it was trying to get me. And I'm mad that I didn't see it coming. And I'm mad that it just got me so hard. But it was probably the most unexpected plot twist I've read in years. And I have to give it props for that because that really doesn't happen very often. And it was wonderful. Like, I really appreciated that she did that to me and made me so mad because it was nice. It was one of those, like, she got me good and I can't even deny it because I was literally so mad after figuring out what the plot twist was. And I don't want to say anything about where it is or what characters it involves or anything just because, like, I feel like if you're expecting it at all, you could guess it. It's just I wasn't. I took certain things for granted in the story, and it's just like don't take anything for granted. Like, man, like that plot twist really got me hard. And then my last point is that she's so good at getting inside the head of characters who are bad is kind of like a vague, overarching way of putting it. But like just like bad people. Like, she takes very negative characters. She gets inside the head of this felon who's just been released from prison for raping and murdering, like, a 16-year-old. She gets inside the head of people who aren't, like, evil, but are just, like, crappy people who, like, they're lazy or they're very prejudiced. And it's just, like, realistically bad people. And I really love that because she captures them so incredibly well. And I'm just, like, down. Like, I'm down for her exploration of crappy people. Like, it's so interesting. And it's so interesting because they can be crappy in very small ways or in very big ways. And it kind of, like, just varies depending on the character. But it's just, like, some of the people are evil, sure. But a lot of them just suck. And it's like, I've known so many people like this who just kind of suck that, like, you just hate them for sucking so much. And, like, you can't even really justify it because they're not the worst people in the universe. They just suck. And I don't know. It's really interesting. I really like how she does capture the perspectives of just, like, people who have entirely different outlooks. People who are like, I'm a cop, I must do the right thing. And people who are like, well, I'm going to be lazy and cut some corners here. And maybe I forget to look at things, but like I'm catching bad guys, so I'm also a good cop. And it's like both characters fully 100% believe the same thing, but for like very different reasons and different justifications. And she does so well at that. So 4 stars for this one. I really enjoyed it. If you like gritty cop thrillers, highly recommend. Like, this is probably my favorite cop thriller series that I have read to date. And I've read a number because I really do like them. And I'm so glad I started with book 1 because this was really fun to read in order. So now I'm going to go through the other 8 books in the series, just briefly tell you my rating and any other thoughts I had. I don't have other thoughts on all of these, but I did want to bring up just some things and then get into kind of like overarching thoughts and how the series changed because I did read it like all within a month and a half, so that did affect like how I experienced it. The second book is Fractured. I also gave this 4 stars, and I don't really have any other thoughts on this, except Wiltshire is dyslexic, and it's mentioned in book 1, but it has much more of a focus in book 2, and it starts to be like a main focus of the stories that like he is not illiterate. It does feel like she does more research as the books go along about like what dyslexia is and how it affects people, and I have no idea if the representation is good because I don't know anything about dyslexia, but he's described as having undiagnosed severe dyslexia. He has a lot of trouble reading. He can read, but not well and not when he's stressed. And it does have like a huge influence on these books. And it's really interesting to see a successful adult character who's dealing with dyslexia. So, yeah, I really enjoyed this one as well. Book 3 in the series is Undone. I also gave this 4 stars. And the only note I have on this one is that at this point, this series, the Will Trent series, combines with the Grant County series. And so if you're interested in like reading that series without spoilers, definitely read, I think there are 5 books in that first, because you will be completely 100% spoiled. And I didn't know that going in, but I do think you definitely don't need to have read it. But if you don't want to be spoiled for Grant County, this will 100% spoil you, because at this point the series just kind of like merge and become one. And I wish I'd known that, because I do plan to read the Grant County series, but I'm sure I will still enjoy that one. Book 4 is Broken. I also gave this 4 stars, and I really think that this might be my favorite book in the series. This deals with more of the Grant County characters. It actually takes place in Grant County, I think, if I'm remembering that correctly, and it deals with people from those books, in particular Detective Lena Adams. Lena is a sucky character, and it's funny to me because everyone in these books hates her so much, just like unbelievably much, and she's not even that bad. Like, compared to other people in these books, she's not that terrible of a person. She just kind of sucks, and I really love her character and the dynamic she brings to these books, because it's just what I said before about Triptych and the different perspectives and how people have like completely polar opposite 180-degree perspectives, that like you cannot be on both characters' sides at once, because one character is right and one is wrong, and it's like you kind of know who the right one is. Like, you can kind of predict early on in the book. It's like, whose side is Will Trent on? Because he's the main character, so we know he has to be right. But it's just interesting because you want to be on both of their sides, because they completely justify everything that they believe. It's very interesting and very well done. And it's one of those books that, like, that statement that, like, no one thinks they're a bad person. Like, no one is doing things because they want to be a bad person or because they think they are a bad person. They're doing things because they think they're right. It's just for different reasons, and their justifications don't always add up. And it's just so well done. And if you're only going to read one book in the series, I do really recommend this one. I think maybe the investigation and the case part of this were kind of lesser to me. They were less interesting, but the character dynamics were so good. Then I read Fallen, which was the first book in the series that I gave 3 stars. This book focuses a lot on the character of Faith, who is Detective Will Trent's partner, and then Sarah is his girlfriend. So just those are the main 3 characters in all of these books. Those are their relationships. Sarah is a doctor. This book focuses on Faith's mother, who has been kidnapped, and because of that there's a huge focus on like Faith and her character, and like 3 main characters, and the actual plot focuses around the main characters. And like I said about Triptych, I don't really like any of her main characters. I find them all kind of irritating, and I think for that reason this book wasn't as enjoyable for me. But you know, that being said, I still really did enjoy it. It was just less so than the others. Then I read Criminal, which is book 6 in the series. I gave this 4 stars. This has a lot about Will Trent's backstory, because he was a ward of the state, and you learn kind of about his parents more, and just about his relationship with his boss, and there's a lot of that going on. So if you're interested in that, this one is probably a good one to gravitate towards early, but I don't know. It was fine. It was 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. Then I read Unseen, which is book 7. I gave this 4 stars as well. Most of these are 4 stars because I really love the series. But I particularly enjoyed this book because Detective Lena Adams came back in this one. And I just really love the dynamic she brings to these books. Like, her actual character, whatever. I don't think she's particularly good or bad compared to the others. It's just that I really like the dynamic she brings and how much everyone hates her, and they're just so convinced that she's 100% wrong all the time. And like, sometimes she is and sometimes she isn't, but she just kind of sucks, and it's wonderful. And like, I really enjoyed this one for that reason. Same as Broken. Then I read The Kept Woman, which I gave 4 stars and don't really have anything to say about it. And finally, book 9, the most recently published book in the series. It came out over the summer. It's called The Last Widow. This is not like the final book, it's just the last published. This came out in the summer of 2019. I gave this 3 stars. It's not that it was worse than the others, it just had a few differences that I really didn't like her storytelling. It had kind of a tedious storytelling structure, I felt, but I could see how it would work for some people. Basically, it's told in overlapping timelines, so you get each character's perspective for like the entire time. So like, for example, made up example, say Will Trent starts the story and his story goes from 1:30 until 2. And that's like the first chapter of the book. And then the next chapter is Sarah's point of view and it goes from 1:45 to 2:10. And you get this kind of weird overlap because of it, and you get some repetitive parts, and I think I would have liked it for like the first 3 chapters, but it kept going on for most of the book, and I did find that tedious after a while. So that was kind of why it got 3 stars, but again, still really enjoyed it, just not quite as much. So, okay, in summary, to like kind of give critiques for the series overall, I do have a number of things I wanted to talk about. And a lot of them tie into points that I have made earlier. I just want to either like qualify those points a little or like change them. The first is characters with different perspectives, which I've mentioned for some of her books. I think this is something she has in nearly every book that I have read, especially in this series, but like in the standalones for her that I've read as well. She does a really great job at capturing characters who have different outlooks on life and entirely different perspectives. And like some of them suck and some of them are good people and some of them are just like whatever. But it's so interesting and she captures them so well that like that is really one of the strengths of the series for me. Her writing is also really good. So I think she has like this really graphic, visceral way of capturing these people and their stories and the crimes that really just draws me into her books. Like, I will pick up one and just be engrossed the entire time I'm reading it, and I don't want to read anything else. I just really loved her writing style. I think she's honestly just like a wonderful writer, and she has a wonderful way of describing everything and capturing all these characters' lives and their stories and these crimes, and I really enjoyed it. Now onto kind of the negatives that I felt like kind of went from book to book. One is that I feel like she kind of lost her edge a little bit. The first books in the series I felt were really dark, were really gritty, like actively made me uncomfortable in that way that it felt like she was very much trying to make you uncomfortable, to question yourself as a reader, that I enjoyed. But I didn't feel that way with her later books in the series. It felt like it was pretty much more par for the course, like the kind of stuff that I'm used to in most thrillers. It didn't seem like it was particularly out there or particularly graphic, and I did notice that because it was so noticeable how dark and gritty they were from the beginning. So that by the time I was getting to the end, I was realizing that I didn't notice that they were dark and gritty anymore, because they just felt more the same and a little bit more generic and like toned down, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because like, you know, I gave them mostly 4 stars anyway, so I clearly did enjoy that. But I did kind of miss her edge a little bit. They just felt like she was getting like a little bit too gritty for like the mainstream, or that she got more mainstream and wanted to like keep her mainstream audience. So like she toned down like her descriptions of corpses and like sexual violence and slurs and things like that. And I did miss that she changed it throughout the books. And then there were some inconsistencies throughout the books. First with characters, it felt like some of the characters changed personalities from book to book, especially Will Trent's wife, first wife, Angie. She's a main character in one of the earlier books and one of the later books, but she does pop up between the books just to like poke her head in and cause drama basically. But it felt like when we got her point of view in book 1, she was a very different character than when we got her point of view in like book 8, I think it was. And that disappointed me because I liked her in book 1 a lot more, and it didn't feel like it was character development and growth. It felt like she was just a different person. And that was something I noticed earlier too. Just like in book one, she was one character, and then by like book three, she'd become someone else, and I didn't enjoy that. And there were inconsistencies with like some details throughout the books that I can't put my finger on a lot of them just because like they were small things that I couldn't prove without like going back and actually confirming details. But it bugged me and I noticed it like consistently throughout like this whole series. The only one example that I could actually prove, because it was something that I specifically remembered, was that in one book, Sarah says, I haven't had a drink of alcohol in over a year because Will doesn't like it when I drink alcohol. And I was like, that's a lie, because in the last book, you had a scotch and you've only known Will for about 18 months. So either these 5 books take place over the course of 8 months and then there's a year gap, or you've had alcohol in the last year. And it was just like little things mostly, like a few bigger things thrown in, but just little things that like really bugged me because I read them so close together that I actually did notice them. And then my final thought is the romance drama between Will and Sarah. I didn't dislike it in particular in any individual book, but overall, once they get together and become a couple, which you pretty much know from the first time they meet that they're going to get together and become a couple because they're instantly like, ooh, that person is attractive. I like them. But once they do like become a solid couple, there's romance drama with them in every book, and it all boils down to the fact that they just don't talk. Like in one book, there was this whole big drama about money because Sarah is a doctor, Sarah has a wealthy family, and Sarah just has a lot of money. Will Trent grew up in the foster care system. He's a special agent for the government. He doesn't have a lot of money. He pays for everything in cash because he has no credit. Sarah worries that the fact that she has much more money than Will has stresses Will out and makes him feel like less of a man because she has like, 15 times as much money as he does, or probably more, honestly. Will worries that Sarah doesn't like that she has more money than him, and it stresses him out that Sarah might not like that he's very poor. Or not, very poor, but like comparatively speaking. And literally, it's all solved when they just talk to each other and realize that, hey, we're both cool with the fact that together we have enough money. And that's just like every single drama they had in the books was like that. They just like wouldn't talk about this stupid issue that would be solved by one conversation at the end. And then they'd be like, oh, I promise to talk to you more from now on. I love you. We'll be happy and together forever. And I was just, it's so tiring. Like, it's not a big part of the books. And it irritates me because it really doesn't need to be there. And it's happened in like 4 straight books, and I was just really getting tired of it. And I would be like, Sarah doesn't like that Will's undercover. Will doesn't tell Sarah when he's undercover. They lie to each other. And then at the end, they're like, I'm so sorry, I should have told you my feelings. And I find it irritating and frustrating, and it's just these books aren't about the romance. Like, the romance, it can be there fine, but there doesn't need to be like plot involving the romance each time. They can just be together. But, that's like kind of a small issue because it's a cop thriller series. You're not reading it for the romance. That's just kind of added on. But I do hope that in future books, Karin Slaughter doesn't focus on the romance so much and just kind of makes them like a happy couple who's together, because I'm okay with that. But overall, I know that was like a long rant for like me apparently supposedly loving all of these books, but I really do love them. I think she's a wonderful writer. Like, I'm honestly so sad that I'm caught up on this series and I just have to wait for like, I don't even know how long. I think there might be a new one coming out next year, but like that makes me sad because I had such a fun time reading all of these. I definitely recommend this series. I think it's a really wonderful series. I think it's really well done. If you like cop series, I can't recommend this enough because I feel like this is the best cop series that I have ever read. I really like cop thrillers, but so many of them are just like really bad or like just like not fun. And the characters are irritating, and I know I said the characters are irritating in this one, but in like a good way. And I would recommend this so much because I feel like this series has honestly made her one of my favorite writers, probably my favorite thriller author. I'll definitely be picking up more from her, and just like until I've read everything that she's written, I will continue reading her. Let me know down below if you read Karin Slaughter, if you read any of her books. I highly, highly recommend them because they're so wonderful. And also let me know if you've read the Grant County series because I'm planning to start those in a few months. And I'd be interested to see what people think of those if they've read them because they sound interesting. I like the Will Trent series and I figure those will kind of be more of the same. As always, thank you guys so much for watching and I will see y'all again soon.